All right, welcome to this review. We're going to be doing the argument from contingency, which is a version of the cosmological argument. Some necessary background. There's a distinction between a contingent being and a necessary one. A contingent being is something that exists but didn't have to. Something that actually exists but possibly does not. And the possibly isn't a matter of uncertainty. We know for sure that contingent beings exist. The possibly is a matter of what could have been. So although I actually exist, I didn't have to. Same with you. If your parents hadn't met, you wouldn't have existed, although you actually do. Here's the NATO alliance. That is a being of some sort. It's an interesting question, what kind of being an alliance like this is. In the actual world, there is such a thing as the NATO alliance. These countries have an agreement going back to World War II. But had history turned out differently, could very well have been different. Maybe these countries would have formed different alliances. Maybe they would have been hostile with each other. But either way, the fact that the NATO alliance exists is a sort of fragile and contingent matter. By contrast, the idea of a necessary being, if there is one, is the idea of a being that actually exists but does not possibly not exist, or it's impossible for this being to not be. This is a being, if there is one, that not only actually exists but would have existed no matter what. Had your parents not met, this being would have existed. Had the NATO alliance not formed, this being would have been. Had life not evolved on planet Earth, the necessary being would still have been, and so on. So theists typically think that God is a necessary being. Indeed, God is a sort of chief necessary being. Even if there, for some theists, might be other necessary beings, like maybe numbers are necessary. Nevertheless, most theists think that God not only is necessary, but also is the sort of foundation of everything else that there is, in the sense that God had to exist, would have existed no matter what. And God's activities, God's decision to create the world, explains or causes all of the contingent things there are. Why are there any contingent things? Well, because God exists and God had to be. So this is the philosopher Leibniz, who really pioneered this version of the argument from contingency. I didn't assign Leibniz, but I just am putting this passage up here. The key driving principle in the argument from contingency is the principle of sufficient reason, which tells us something or makes a claim about contingent beings. Here's what Leibniz says, and then we'll translate it. Whatever exists, so says Leibniz, has a cause, a reason, a ground of its existence. So by those terms, cause, reason, and ground, he means basically the same thing, an explanation, a foundation on which its existence relies. Whatever does, whatever is, has a reason for its existence, a ground or reason why it does exist rather than not exist. And then he goes on to specify two options, either in the necessity of its own nature, and then, he says, it must have been of itself eternal or everlasting, or in the will of some other being. And by will, he doesn't exclusively mean like conscious intention, although he includes that under will, but just more generally, one thing bringing about something else, bringing it into existence. And then that other being must, that is the one that brings it into existence, at least in the order of nature and causality, have existed before it. So what's going on here? Well, Leibniz is saying that everything has a cause, and then that's the sort of most unrestricted version of the principle of sufficient reason. He goes on to say, either we're talking about a being that's necessary, in which case the fact that it's necessary, the fact that it had to be, explains why it is. We'll come back to that in a minute. Or we're talking about a contingent being. And there, a contingent being, its very nature doesn't explain why it is, because it could very well not have been. So there must be something outside of a contingent being, something other than it, that causes it to be. And this latter claim is the specific version of the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, that matters for the argument. Every contingent being has a cause outside of itself. And I'm going to henceforth just call this the PSR. Every contingent being has a cause of its existence outside of itself. That principle is going to drive the argument. We're going to compress that principle and make it a little bit easier to manage. And the way we're going to do that is introduce one more distinction, and that's the distinction between a dependent being and an independent being. So a dependent being, let's say, is a being that is caused to exist by something outside of itself. Something other than that being brings it into existence. Examples: you and me as well. Every human being. We're all dependent in the sense that our parents brought us into existence. I'm fortunately not my father or mother. You're not either. Nevertheless, they're responsible for you, and mine are responsible for me. In a causal sense, they brought us into being. So we're dependent entities. We can now swap in the PSR the idea of a dependent being. The PSR said every contingent being has a cause of its existence outside of itself. A shorter way of saying that is that every contingent being is dependent. An independent being, if there is one, or a self-existent being, this is the way Rowe puts it, is a being whose own nature explains why it exists. So if you ask why an independent being is, there's an answer, but it's not outside of the being. We're going to come back to that. There's a deep connection between a necessary being and an independent being. How could a thing's nature explain why it is? Well, suppose it's necessary. Suppose it had to be. Why is it that a necessary being exists? Answer: because it had to be, because it's necessary. So I didn't have to look outside the being to find an explanation. Its very nature explained why it is. But notice that dependence and independence are not the same idea, or not the same concept as contingent and necessary. Even though there are deep philosophical connections between them, the definitions are different. The defender of the PSR wants to link them up. And that's what the PSR does and what the argument from contingency does. But it's important not to confuse the definitions. Finally, the idea of an uncaused being, to complete this framework, is one that has no cause whatsoever, either inside of itself or outside of itself. Why is an uncaused being there? Why does it exist? Well, nothing outside of it explains it, and its nature doesn't explain it. So it's completely unexplained. Leibniz and other defenders of the PSR say absolutely every being had better be either dependent or independent. No being can be uncaused. Not possible. Everything has a reason, or ground,